I am not a historian, but neither are you. So, how about we, the people, learn this stuff together? Welcome to US 101. In today's episode, guys, we're going to be talking about things made out of iron and bronze and stone. Guys, you have got to give credit where it's due, right? And we have to give credit to the president because he is currently dealing with the biggest crisis that America has ever faced. No, I'm not talking about the pandemic and the fact that nearly 3 million Americans have been infected with COVID-19 and around 130,000 Americans have died from it. Or the fact that there are still nearly 15% of Americans out of a job and filing for unemployment. Or the fact that the president is standing against protesters who chant that Black Lives Matter and are continuing to rail against police brutality and systemic racism in this country. Or the fact that the president knew that the Russians were paying bounties to Afghan militants to kill US soldiers. No, none of that stuff. Guys, I'm obviously talking about the defacing and destruction of statues and monuments. Duh. Don't believe me? Just look at the president's Twitter feed where he posted numerous wanted style posters of people who allegedly defaced and destroyed statues and monuments. And on top of that, he signed an executive order which puts anyone who defaces a statue in prison for 10 years. 10 years! For spray painting an object. Because this president, guys, along with many other Americans, believe that if you deface or destroy a statue, you are also defacing and destroying American history. I mean, come on. How are these people supposed to know about historical figures or historical events without these statues? What do you expect them to do? Read? But it's because of all this hoopla over statues and monuments that discussion has been stirred up. Are statues and monuments necessary? When does the life of a monument end? Should some statues and monuments be removed from the public eye because what they represent is no longer relevant? So this week, guys, I wanted to discuss a specific monument that is held in very high regard in the country and is also a major tourist stop in the United States. Yet its history is a bit problematic as its creation is built on an unstable foundation and is seen by some as a continued attempt to whitewash American history. I am talking, my friends, about the mother of all American monuments, Mount Rushmore. You're all familiar with Mount Rushmore. Carved into the side of a mountain in South Dakota are the faces of 4 American presidents who many consider to be the greatest of all presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. A titanic tribute to their contributions in the building of this nation and made big enough so that the whole world can know about them and in turn the greatness and exceptionalism of America itself. So let's go ahead and dive into the history of this monument, okay? Let's take you back to the year 1868. We are 3 years removed from the end of the Civil War. The Union and the Confederacy have ended their battle between each other, but there is still a battle raging between Americans and Native Americans further west. Tribes like the Lakota Sioux are still active out west and continue to defend their land from westward expansion and from being pushed off of lands that they have made their home. But in 1868, what's known as the Treaty of Fort Laramie is signed by representatives of the Sioux tribes and General William T. Sherman. This treaty promises the Sioux, quote, undisturbed use and occupation, end quote, of a large swath of territory, including the Black Hills in South Dakota. But you've all seen this story before, and as you probably guessed, that treaty means little to nothing. Why? Because in the 1870s, gold is found in the Black Hills, which means prospectors are making their way toward the Black Hills to mine up all the gold and to strike it rich for themselves. And what happens when prospectors and miners come to a certain area? More people flood into the territory to create boom towns to support those miners and to start businesses for themselves. So the government ends up forcing the Sioux tribes to give back land that they were just handed by the government so that white Americans can go in, tear up the area so that they can mine gold. You should also know that during this time, guys, many white Americans believed that if Native Americans did not assimilate to white American culture, they were very much still seen as a threat to white American safety. In fact, in 1873, during his presidential inauguration address, Ulysses S. Grant said of Native Americans that in order for them to peacefully become a part of the United States, they must be brought, quote, under the benign influences of education and civilization. It is either this or war of extermination. However, most natives during this time, guys, don't want to assimilate. They want to continue celebrating their own tribal cultures, their own tribal traditions, their own tribal beliefs. Most would rather fight and die instead of assimilate. And indeed, there would be resistance from the Sioux, with Lakota warriors like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse leading campaigns against U.S. troops that were trying to move on to their land. In fact, the most notable Sioux victory, guys, happens in the year 1876, America's centennial, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn against General George Custer. And this defeat of American soldiers, especially during the 100th birthday of American independence, basically spurs the United States government to double down against any sort of native resistance, which would ultimately lead us to the year 1890 and the Massacre at Wounded Knee. In case you don't know, really briefly, the Massacre at Wounded Knee, guys, happens in 1890 when hundreds of Sioux men, women, and children, most of them unarmed, are murdered by American soldiers. And that massacre ends up pretty much being the nail in the coffin when it comes to full-on native resistance against the United States government. So now that the native tribes are no longer an issue, what to do with all of this land? Well, besides enticing people to move there, one man wanted to make the area a place where tourists could come to enjoy all of the wonderful nature. That and also help to boost the economy of the area, because now that the miners were gone, the economy was sagging. So in the 1920s, a South Dakota state historian named Doane Robinson comes up with the idea of sculpting within the rock face of a mountain the images of American Western heroes, people like Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark, and Red Cloud, one of the Sioux chiefs that signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie. So in 1924, Robinson reaches out to a sculptor that he first had in mind to do the job, but unfortunately that sculptor isn't available. So Robinson then goes to his second choice, a sculptor by the name of Gutzon Borglum, to do the job. Now let's just briefly divert for a bit about Mr. Borglum's background, because his history is kind of interesting. Borglum was a sculptor based out of Connecticut who, in 1914, was asked by a woman named C. Helen Plain if he would come down to Atlanta, Georgia to do a job for them. Oh, by the way, Plain, you should know, was the president of a little group you might have heard of called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And the job she wanted Borglum to do was to come down and carve into the side of Stone Mountain sculptures of Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Stone Mountain, by the way, a year later in 1915 would also be the place where the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan was born. And Borglum happily accepted the job, which, by the way, was also partially funded by the Klan. Also, just so you know, Borglum himself was not affiliated with the Klan. He wasn't a Klan member. But according to the author John Taliaferro in his book, Great White Fathers, he said that Borglum, quote, nonetheless became deeply involved in Klan politics, end quote. However, by the early 1920s, the funding for the Stone Mountain Project dried up at the time, and that's when Robinson approached Borglum and said, hey, I've got this idea I'd like you to do in South Dakota, come and do it. So Borglum accepts that job instead. Now, Robinson's original idea for the project, which was, again, to carve the images of American Western heroes into the side of the mountain, yeah, that was turned down by Borglum. Instead, he tells Robinson, you know what, that's all well and good, but let's do this instead. Why don't we carve images of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln on the side of the mountain? Yeah, that'd be a lot better. Let's do that instead. And then later on, Borglum thinks about it and he goes, you know what, Washington and Lincoln, that's good, but let's add a couple more guys. Let's add Thomas Jefferson and Teddy Roosevelt into the mix. But the initial reaction to the creating of what would become Mount Rushmore was not positive, guys. I mean, besides Native Americans and environmentalists being against the idea, the general public pretty much didn't understand why a project like that would need to be done. In fact, one newspaper claimed that the Mount Rushmore project would be, quote, as incongruous and ridiculous as keeping a cow in the rotunda of the Capitol building, end quote. Yet, the funding was achieved, and in 1927, work on the carvings begin, and it finishes in 1941. And then 50 years later, in 1991, Mount Rushmore underwent a $40 million restoration project to make sure that all four faces of the president were kept as intact as possible. Now, here's the thing, guys. To a lot of people, monuments like Mount Rushmore mean something. I get it. A lot of Americans believe that monuments and statues are their history. They're a part of their heritage, and they feel that they must be displayed for all the world to see to show the greatness of that history. But if I could just let you in on a little secret, guys, monuments and statues, well, nice to look at, are not history. Okay? They're not. They're objects. They're made of metal or they're made of stone. They are things That's it. Now, there are some memorials, some monuments that I believe are warranted and are appropriate, such as the memorials dedicated to soldiers that passed in previous wars, like the World War monuments or the Vietnam Memorial. But most monuments and statues only tell a partial story, guys, because monuments and statues don't provide context and they don't have nuance to them. Ultimately, their goal is to advance a narrative of exceptionalism about that specific person or that specific event. But here's the problem. It's that exceptionalism narrative that blinds a lot of Americans so that they can't see past the shimmering patina of that statue. Because that statue or that monument, guys, represents the history that some people want to know and the history that they want to celebrate. For example, proponents of Confederate statues and monuments say that their removal from the public is an affront to their heritage. Even President Trump has tweeted that these statues shouldn't be removed because it symbolizes their heritage. Heritage being the operative word there. Because that heritage and the revering and celebrating of these monuments and statues also celebrates the subjugation and enslavement of an entire race of people and those who would rise up against their own nation in order to maintain that subjugation. So why is that something that we would want to enshrine and present as American exceptionalism? Germany is an incredible nation today. It's a powerful nation. Show me the statues of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich and the Nazis. Where are they? Find me the statues or the monument that celebrate Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda. Go ahead and find me the statues or the monuments that are in public that celebrate Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge regime. Find them for me. You won't. Now, I know some of you guys are going to go ahead and say, well, if that's the case, then why don't you go ahead and apply that logic to statues of Washington and Jefferson? They were slave owners. Why don't you go ahead and tear down those statues? Go ahead. I don't need a statue of Washington to know about him, okay? He's everywhere. He's got a state and the capital of the country named after him. He's got hundreds, if not thousands, of books written about him. He's got movies about him, television shows about him. You can go visit his house in Virginia. He's on the $1 bill. And also, if that's your counter argument to my case, then I would have to say that your argument is just a wee bit flawed. The author John Meacham was asked in an interview about the bringing down of statues and monuments in the United States, and he said something that I really very much agree with. He said, quote, "If you were devoted to the American experiment of a journey toward a more perfect union, however imperfect you may have been, then you should be commemorated. But if you were taking up arms against the order that actually produced the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that produced the Civil Rights Act, that produced the country that we still, for all our unhappiness, we want to defend, then you shouldn't." And I very much agree with that sentiment, but I'd also like to expand on it just a little bit. I personally believe that massive monuments and massive statues aren't really designed to commemorate the person or event in particular. They're ultimately designed to display, in the most colossal way possible, the greatness of America and what historian Lendell Calder calls America's, quote, glory story. And what he means by glory story, guys, is that quote-unquote traditional American history narrative, which celebrates America's progress, victories, successes moving forward, but gives little to no thought about anybody that appears in the American history narrative that isn't white or isn't male. Mount Rushmore, guys, really is no different. It's a gigantic salute to 4 presidents who were devoted to the American experiment in spite of their flaws, but more than that, it's mammoth praise to the idea that America should be celebrated for its largeness and weight on the planet. But if you step back from Mount Rushmore just a bit to take in a wider picture, you'll also see something else in that area in South Dakota. In 1948, in the Black Hills of South Dakota, work began on another monument which was destined to be larger than Mount Rushmore. Now, that monument still is in progress today because it receives no federal funding and has been unfinished for over 70 years. Now, you can actually visit it today. Tourists can actually go and see it because the only part of it that's completed is the face. And it's the face of the Lakota warrior Crazy Horse who led the battle at Little Bighorn and won against General George Custer. To me, this unfinished monument represents American history at its core, okay? It's incomplete, it's very rough, and not often discussed because little about it is known. Yet its face and the rest of it is a continuing work in progress and an ever-changing narrative to include all facets of our story. To remind Americans that the completed glory story is only a fraction of our history, and that even though the work is slow, when the rock is chiseled away and sculpted to completion, a much bigger history can be told that includes everyone. And that, my friends, is it for this episode of US 101. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me this week. Really do appreciate it. As always, you can follow US 101 on social media everywhere: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, all those links down below in the description box. Guys, I will see you soon. I'm taking a little bit of time away from US 101 to deal with some personal things on my end. Nothing bad, I assure you. Everything's okay. Just stepping away for a little bit just to deal with some stuff on my end. But I will be back hopefully sooner than later. But I appreciate the continued support for the channel. Please continue to leave comments on the videos, share them, like them, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so. I can't thank you enough again for all the support. I will see you guys soon for an all-new episode of Us 101. Until then, I am all done. Happy 4th of July, everybody.